Welcome to the Delight in the Limelight show. I'm your host, Linda Ugalo, a speaking confidence coach and author of the book Delight in the Limelight. We're here to help you transform your experience of speaking from dread to loving it instead, whether it's on stage, on camera, in the media, or the meeting room. And today we're talking about feeling awkward and how we feel awkward about feeling awkward and how we can change that so awkward becomes less awkward. And here with me to help us see awkward in a new way is Henna Pryor. Henna is a workplace performance expert, a 2 times TEDx speaker, a global keynote presenter, and she champions embracing awkwardness in order to boost strategic risk taking in a fun and no nonsense way. She shared her insights with global giants like Google, Workday, Johnson and Johnson, and has been featured in Forbes, NBC, and the Washington Post. Last month, she came out with her new book, Good Awkward: How to Embrace the Embarrassing and Celebrate the Cringe to Become the Bravest You. Welcome, Henna.
Thank you so much. And I always laugh, when we think about good awkward, nothing to this day feels more awkward than having your bio read to you. I think I'm still waiting to get used to that one.
Okay, so let's start there because that's
Sure.
something that I like to work with my clients when they
Yeah.
overcome the fear of speaking, of just taking it in, like breathing it in,
Yeah.
let it fill you up because
Yeah.
my God, what a fantastic accomplishment. And not just the book, but everything that you do. And why not celebrate and feel, it's something to feel great about. So let's not diminish that.
Yeah.
Let's see how we can have a new relationship to having your
Yeah.
bio read.
I love that. No, this is truly one of my own awkward edges of overcoming. I grew up in a household where we were told sort of don't brag, right? Don't boast. And so my second TEDx actually was about this sort of specific angle of awkwardness, this idea of bragging and how in a hybrid world we need to share our wins. I want people to know about my accomplishments because it's important to my career, to my longevity. And yet, there still is a feeling that sometimes arises, especially if we've heard messages most of our lives around what that represents. And so it's leaning into that feeling and staying with it. That definitely is an edge that continues to be developed for me.
Yeah, yeah. I like to think of it as a gift. Just like I feel like people's attention is a gift,
Yeah.
that having someone read our bio is a gift, and so we take it in graciously. It's like, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. It feels easier and easier, right? Which is part of the assertion of the book. It's just, it's reps, it's practice. And so it used to make me feel very awkward and uncomfortable to sit there and just, smile when someone was reading it. Less so every day.
But it's not so much about the smile, it's about the feeling of receiving.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love in the book, this is something I was going to talk about later, but we're talking about it now. It's not just reps, it's deliberate practice.
Yes.
And it's practicing these small things that allows us to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's about like just breathing and saying, wow, how nice that Linda's reading this to me.
Mm-hmm. And in this context, it's, really getting behind also what that feeling represents. And so I've actually, beyond just practicing receiving, also spent very intentional time thinking about what are the messages attached to this emotion that I've carried for years. I mean, let's be frank, decades. That are contributing to this feeling. And so I always think of it as a two-parter: peel back those messages and then getting used to it, right? Putting in those reps.
Yes, for sure. So, I don't think you've read my book, Delight in the Limelight.
Not yet. I will.
I have a 3-part framework, and the first one is to reveal and heal. So we uncover the messages, the experiences that we had. And my feeling is that it's really helpful to resolve them or heal them in some way from that time, through our memories and our sense of our younger selves, so that we have so it's kind of cleared. Because what happens, and I guess this is happening with awkwardness to some degree, as well as with fear, is that we're getting triggered.
Yeah.
We're getting triggered from those past experiences. So we want to work with the past experiences in a way so they don't get triggered, that we feel like we feel present rather than tugged on from the past.
Right, right. We need to rewrite our stories to a degree because truly the biggest concern that many people have around this feeling of awkwardness is, what will they think? It is a social emotion, meaning we don't tend to experience awkwardness or embarrassment or cringe when we are by ourselves. I have many a time spilled cereal or milk all over the counter when I'm home by myself. I have many a time mispronounced a name when I'm home by myself. But interestingly, I never feel awkward about those things because it didn't happen in front of anyone. Right.
Yeah,
So awkwardness is a social emotion. And so when it comes to rewriting these stories, many of us, save for a very select few professions, don't work in isolation. We work with other people. And so when we think about rewriting stories, some of this work has to involve the part of our brain that addresses how do we feel about other people and activities that have happened before.
right.
What happened last time I did that? And what did I
Exactly.
think that person was thinking about me in that moment?
Exactly, and all the
Yeah.
interpretations we make and projections, yeah. I do wanna
Yeah.
circle back about
Yeah.
that, the idea of we're not embarrassed by ourselves because I have experienced embarrassment by myself frequently, and I'll give you
Mm.
an example. So I've been working I joined a singing group in my 20s, and I noticed after about 10 years I was with them for 40 years. After about 10 years, my confidence started to sink.
Mm.
And it got to a place where I couldn't hold a constant note without my voice wavering,
Wow.
and even I was taking voice lessons throughout all these decades, weekly, sometimes twice a week, and yet
Mhm.
I couldn't control my voice. And actually, when I started to write my book, I recognized that I wasn't able to improve because I had some triggering experiences that needed to be cleared away. And
Ah.
I made a pact with myself that by the time I finished my book, I would have used the same processes around my singing as I teach people to do
Mm.
for speaking. But so
Yeah.
what I noticed is that I got to a place where I felt really good in my singing voice, and I'd say, "Okay, now I'm gonna record it so I can hear it." As soon as I put the recorder on, I couldn't sing the
Mm.
same way. And finally,
Mhm.
one day I said, "What's going on?" And I realized and I teach this to my students too, so I can't believe it took me so long to remember. I
Yeah.
was the one judging myself. Because
Mhm.
we can be our own harshest critics.
Oh,
And
yeah.
when I had that recorder on, I was embarrassing myself but by the kinds of things I was saying, like, I don't know what it was exactly, but I was afraid of my own judgment, and so I couldn't
Interesting.
perform. I could not
Yes.
perform.
So the connection I'd make here, and when I was researching awkwardness and embarrassment, as both of them are defined, it is often in the context of social emotion. But interestingly, there was a lot of studies that came out when the pandemic first hit its kind of full steam, and we were on Zoom for the first time, and many of us would keep our self view on, right? And we look in mirrors, but most of us aren't accustomed to staring at ourselves
Right.
all day, every day, right? And often people would think to themselves, God, does my hair always stick up like that? Is it always that frizzy? Right. And so, what you're describing, interestingly, even though those moments happen in isolation, because you're right, a similar thing happens when we rewatch ourselves on video
That's
by
right.
ourselves, when we hear our voice on a recording by ourselves. So, even though we're in isolation in those moments, what our brains subconsciously do is kind of put together this connection of, oh, is that how other people see me? Is that who they hear? Right? It's
And
kind of
I think
lightning
it's
fast.
it's that, and it's also my standards.
Your
I have certain
expectations.
my
Yeah.
expectations and my own
Mhm.
standards of what I expect of myself. That I
Mhm.
mean, it's funny that you say that because I part of my Comfy on Camera course, there's a module, "Watch yourself on video without
Mhm.
cringing,"
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's a process of getting to, be able to embrace what we see.
Yeah, this is
The things we wanna change and the things we can't change.
exactly right. Yeah, and I think, this is another piece of the heart of this, even in contexts that aren't social, awkwardness and uncertainty go hand in hand. We don't tend to experience awkwardness in the presence of full certainty. If we've done something 1,000 times, we know how it's going to go. Awkwardness is a result of whether we intentionally had it or not. sometimes it's subconscious. We had an expectation. We thought this was how this interaction was going to go. When I was walking down the sidewalk, I thought I would make it to the end of that sidewalk without tripping on my feet, right? I had a subconscious expectation of how that was going to go, and that expectation went sideways. And so, yeah, we do tend to, when we rewatch a video or hear a recording, in our minds, there was something, this is how this was going to look. And then we watch it back and we're like, oh,
That's right.
that's not what I expected.
Right.
Right?
I didn't
That's not what
realize
that
I was
is.
monotone. I didn't realize that I
Right.
didn't show any energy. I didn't yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It kind of like changes it impacts our self-image. And I want to ask you about self-image because
Hmm.
there are people who feel embarrassed about ways that they look. Maybe it's their body size or their skin or their hair or their teeth or the shape of my nose was something that I felt very awkward about because of comments that my mom made to me when I was young.
Oh, yeah.
How do you have you dealt with that with your clients at all? Like feeling like they're shy to show up because of their
Sure.
self-image?
Of course. Yeah. I think there's very few humans that are immune from some version of that, right? It exists on a spectrum for sure. We've got extreme and then we've got little things that we don't love about ourselves. All of this, and I'm sure you speak to this in your work often, it has to do with what were the messages we received growing up. I've heard a lot of messages growing up. I have my father's nose, a strong nosed woman who I've now grown to love it. But growing up, I sure didn't. I was taller than all the boys. I'm almost 5'8". And so, and I was kind of a lanky beanpole back then. As an adult, that seems to be a favorable thing, 5'8" and lanky. But as a teenager, I remember crying in the doctor's office about having chicken ankles. I'll never
Oh,
forget it. I was in tears about my chicken ankles, right? Things that I look at now and I'm like, oh, good Lord, right? This was the worst of your problems. But the truth of the matter is, again, you said this at the top. We see ourselves in a very different lens, through a very distorted lens that often amplifies that spotlight effect, right? So Cornell psychologist Tom Gilovich talks about the spotlight effect. We think people are paying much closer attention to us than they actually are. So if I'm, a little bit sensitive about my teeth or my nose or my weight or my body shape, we incorrectly assume that everyone else is staring at those things with the same intensity that we are. And research tells you they're simply not. They're more
yeah,
concerned about their own teeth
yeah,
or their own body shape, but they're
yeah,
really not putting that intensity on us like we think they are.
yes, and certainly not to the degree that we do ourselves.
Oh, never. No one can
Yeah,
ever do it to the degree that we do it to ourselves. I'm convinced
yeah,
of.
yeah. So so we talked about, where messages come from. By the way, I just want to mention that at the beginning of the book, you talk about EEE, which I
Mhm.
just loved.
Yeah.
Wanna tell us what that stands for? It's so
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, this is probably, I sometimes get asked, what was your favorite piece of research from the book? And this was actually probably it, because to me, it was something I'd never heard. And as soon as I heard it, it made so much sense. So EEE stands for easily empathetically embarrassed. So you'll know if you are high on EEE because you are probably someone who refers to yourself as empathetic. And let me first say, empathy is a beautiful thing. I'm not here to engineer anyone's empathy out of them. Empathy, especially with what's happening in the world at the time of our recording, we need more empathy. However, there is one specific type of empathy, this easily empathetically embarrassed, where sometimes people are so high on this type of empathy that not only do they struggle to tolerate their own embarrassment, but when they see someone else embarrass themselves or they see someone else have an awkward moment on stage in a meeting, they take that on literally as though it's their own, right? Their whole body goes hot. It's almost as though it's happening to them. And when we have that high level of EEE in us, it makes it very difficult to take the risks that we want to take, because we assume that people feel that same intense feeling when we have a misstep, when we
Yes.
have an embarrassment. And the truth is, most people don't.
Yeah, yeah. But, it's so interesting as I'm listening to you speak, it reminds me how I often will tell people, you could have your own experiences, but you could also be traumatized from other people having their experiences. So I'm thinking
Mhm.
of, let's say in school, someone is brought up to the teacher knows someone doesn't know the answer and they say, "Well, come up here and show me where Romania is." This
Right.
happened to one of my clients, and she got up there and she just started to cry.
Right.
Now, how do you think the other students felt in the classroom?
Yeah.
If they didn't know the answer also, they would have a trauma from that as well. So it
Hmm.
makes me wonder, as you speak about this, that perhaps this EEE could be a form of trauma also, that they have been either embarrassed themselves or they've seen the, impact of someone else's ridicule
Yeah, for
that
sure.
that makes them highly sensitive to it.
Right. And this, again, this is so much more art than science. It can. So for some people, they would experience an event like that. And depending on how they were brought up and depending on their level of tolerance in these situations, they might take that on so fully that it leads them to inaction, right?
Yes.
I'm never going to volunteer to do that. I saw what happened to so and so. For others, and again, with children, it's a little difficult because they're still developing, but for others, they may see this as, "Ooh, I feel really bad for that girl. I feel really bad for that person. What can I do to make sure that doesn't happen to me the next time?" Right? But it is very natural. Humans are wired for social acceptance. That is a real hardwired human need. And we don't want to see any of our fellow humans hurting. Our brains respond in very similar ways to social pain,
Yeah.
which is one of the best things about us as a species. So many of us, save for sociopaths, do experience that feeling to a point, especially when it's someone we know, like a classmate. If
Mm,
that's our friend, we're going to feel it at an even deeper level than we would if
yeah.
it's a stranger. The real tension then becomes, what did it create as a result? Did it create a situation where we're never going to do that because of what we watched? Or did it create I feel for her. What can I do to make sure I don't have that same reaction or feeling if I ever get put in that situation in the future? That's where
Mhm.
that tipping point starts to hit.
Yes, and that leads me to this question of, a lot of times, if someone, in terms of speaking, if someone is very nervous and they know
Mhm.
that it shows, maybe they have a blush that their face turns red, or maybe their voice shakes,
Mhm.
and then they feel nervous that other people are gonna feel nervous for them.
Yep.
What would you
Mhm.
how would you work with a client like that?
Yeah, it happens all the time, right? Especially as it relates to speaking and, very distant second networking. But I think speaking is really up there by several leaps and bounds on what people find to feel the most awkward. To that, I would say two things. First, there's something called the illusion of transparency, which is we tend to think that people can read all of these physical cues as clearly as we can. The blush in our face, the shaking of our hands, or the knocking of our knees. Sometimes they can. I'm not here to say that your physical cues are invisible. Sometimes they can, but again, often not to the intensity that we think. Just because you feel hot and sweaty doesn't mean that they can see how hot and sweaty you feel, right? So just reminding yourself of that is a useful starting point. The second thing is, this really does boil down to both preparation and having techniques to lean on in the moment. So by preparation, I will tell you, when I still step onto a larger stage with brighter lights and a bigger audience, I still get nervous. This is my job. I still get nervous. And I always say that nerves are care dressed in costume, right? I care. So I think I'm always going to be nervous to some degree, but I have pre-event things that I do because I know that my body will otherwise react. So I will do jumping jacks in the back. When I get nervous on stage, and here's a little just secret that I'm going to tell everybody, I will sometimes put my hands behind my back and clasp my hands. But what I'm actually doing behind my back is squeezing my hands, really balling and unballing my fists to get some of that nervous energy out. Because if I don't get it out in some other way, it will show up as
Yeah,
a shake. It
yeah,
will show up as a red face or a sweat. And
yeah.
so having techniques both ahead and in the moment, sometimes in the moment, it's, wow, I feel a little more nervous than usual. You must be an extra smart group today, right? Just something that diffuses the tension. But it really boils down to prep and having in the moment techniques.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, I would add, clearing away the past experiences would help as
Mhm. Of
because
course.
we all have that. But I like what that technique that you used about it's giving the jitters a place to go.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I like that behind back hand squeeze. You can also squeeze your legs together, feel
Yep.
the
Yep.
strength in your legs, just
Yep.
like
I do it with
like
my toes too, right?
yeah.
Squeeze and unsqueeze the
Right,
toes.
right. So, engaging the muscles is going to, override. And in the same way, if your voice is wavering, you can bring more volume or resonance, more depth to it because
Mhm.
you are providing more space for the waves to go into.
Right, right.
I mean,
I love your expression of just give the jitters a place to go. I think that's so much more freeing
mhm,
than eliminate the jitters.
mhm.
You know?
Well, yeah, I think, when they're there, and so you have to work with them.
Yeah.
And to me, that's why I say there's like a difference between managing fear and dissolving the fear. The dissolving the
Yeah.
fear is looking a little more deeply about why it's there in the first place. I mean,
Exactly.
like when you get on stage, it's like, well, why are you a little nervous today? I mean, that's a good
Yes.
question to ask. You're not going to ask in the moment because you're there to do a job.
Right.
But it's
Right.
still worthwhile to then return and say, so what was it? What was I thinking? What was I expecting? What was I just like you would do around the messages for feeling awkward, that we can deconstruct it a little bit and then follow, well, where have I felt that before? Is that still the things that my dad said to me? Is that what
Yeah.
Mrs. Haddad said to me in 3rd grade? Like,
Mhm.
do I need to go over that again and do a little more clearing around that? Because
Yeah.
I don't wanna carry that and this is why. I've heard, the caring, and I think we do care, but we care about, are we good enough?
Right, right. We care about the
So
wrong
where does
things.
that
Right,
exactly.
right.
So where does that do we need to carry that? So, like, if you love cooking and you've got people that you are excited about coming over and you
Mhm.
want them to love the food, are you nervous in the kitchen as you make the pilau or the lasagna?
Right, right.
It's like, I don't, and I use that as a guide. If I'm not afraid to do the things I love, how can I make speaking something I love as well?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think
Maybe
that's beautiful, and I
yeah.
think, you're right in that I to this day, and I always like to make sure this is present tense. I think sometimes people look at, folks like you, Linda, who teach speaking, or folks like me who are speakers or both, right? And they think they've got it sorted, right? They've got it sorted. But what's interesting about human emotion, and specifically emotions like awkwardness or embarrassment, is again, they're social emotions. And the one thing that we cannot predict is other people's reaction, other people's behavior. And when our success hinges on that, it is a recipe for feeling that emotion in exponential form all the time. I'll just share a recent example. I gave a keynote recently and I thought I did pretty well. I was pretty proud of myself. I felt very prepared. People in the audience were very engaged, very into it. And I still remember looking over at this one person who was just on their phone, completely on their phone, not even looking up. And I'm like, for a minute, there's still that part of you that's, well, I suck. Clearly, I'm not engaging enough, right? There's something that I did that's embarrassing for me. Until, again, you do this pre work, these stories. Listen, I'm a mom. I have a 13-year-old and 11-year-old. What if the kid's school was texting?
That's right.
What if my husband was like, so and so needs to be picked up with a fever? I'd be on my phone too.
That's
Right. And
right.
I'm not someone who would be rude to a speaker or,
Right,
unattentive on purpose.
right.
But wow, Henna, that's a whole lot of ego thinking this is all about you. Right. And so it's caring for the right reasons, like you suggested.
Right.
What is this about?
And what I also love what you just said is that we can prepare
Mhm.
for those kinds of moments. There are
Yep.
gonna be moments that people are on their phone, so how do you want to interpret that? Or how do you
Yes.
want to not interpret? Just say,
Right.
"No interpretation." And
Right.
that can be your practice. In fact,
Yeah.
that could be like one time that once someone gets up to speak, they can say, "Today, I'm going to my practice is noticing when I see someone not what I think might not engage is not engaged, and
Yep.
let go of my interpretation."
Right.
And that's all
Right.
that if I do that, I've notched up my speaking.
Yes, I think that that's such a useful practice. And often people will hear that and go, yeah, that's a good idea. But then they don't stop and do it. They don't stop and actually really let themselves reflect on that. And I'll share in that context, I now have a sort of metric I've created for myself, which is if there's lots of people on their phone, that says that I could stand to rework my material and that there's something about it that's not engaging them. It's not hooking them, whether it's my delivery, whether it's the content. I take that as a learning moment. If there's one or two, this is just the world we live in. This is the society we live in where people have a hard time removing it from their hand. And I try to remind myself that that has nothing to do with me. But if I don't reflect on that ahead of an engagement, to your point, something like that, it's easy to derail everything that you're feeling in the positive ways when you see something like that.
So how do you if you see half the people on their phones
Yeah.
and you have that thought, okay, I've got to work on this. How do you also hold that for yourself so that you don't devolve, so you don't lose energy, so that you're able
Yeah.
to still keep moving forward with how you want to be in the talk?
Yeah. So I think it depends. I'll just answer for me, and this is really based in the research as well. But for me, depends on what I'm presenting. So if it is a large group in which I can't say maybe make an adjustment on the fly, I just have done this sort of mental preparation to say, if you notice that, I need you to have a lightning fast talk track of just keep going. Keep going. Don't think about anything else. Just keep going. And rather than looking at the room, I typically challenge myself to maybe pick the one or two heads that are paying attention, or to just do some scanning of not looking at people in the eye, because it might throw me if I've kind of gotten into my head a bit. Just keep going. Now, if it's a smaller room, I love to use humor as a tool to diffuse awkwardness. I have more than once said, okay, I'm reading the room here. Clearly, something's missing the mark, right? Because I've noticed a few people kind of got distracted by their phones. So let me take a moment to back up and say, what are we calling, BS on? What are we not into here? What have you already heard before? Let's make this a conversation instead, right? Or let's turn to a neighbor and talk about something here. I try to be agile enough to just see something's not working here. Where else can we take this? And I generally try to do it with a touch of self-deprecation and a touch of humor, because interestingly, well-placed self-deprecation, A, diffuses awkwardness, but B, also demonstrates confidence, right? I'm not diminishing my skills. I'm not saying, oh, I must be a pretty bad speaker. I'm not saying anything like that. But what I am saying sweetly is something clearly is missing the mark here. Because we've got a group of this size, let's take a minute. Let's talk about it, right? And that is courageous sometimes to do, because you never want to hear you're missing the mark or admit that you're missing the mark. But in that moment, it's not about me. It's about being in service of the group. And so depending on the context, one of those two things.
Yes, yes. I think that I love that you said self-deprecation. I think that it's a skill that we need to foster more. I mean, I may not get nervous when I speak anymore, but I certainly make plenty of mistakes. And so
Sure. Constantly.
I forget things. I stumble. And I wrote in my email about our live stream today about the time that I started a talk with a slide that had a typo in it. It was overcoming the fear of pubic speaking.
Oh, I've done that too. I've literally written exactly that. Yes, that's hilarious. That's great.
And it was like, thank God this is a group of women.
Oh, that's great. That's so good.
Listen,
Yeah,
I mean, it was embarrassing, it was awkward, but it would have been more awkward in a mixed group
sure.
for me, just because of my history. It may not be
Yeah.
for everyone. So
Yeah,
I
agreed.
think it's so important to be able to. I mean, I've gotten to a place that I purposely. I think in the book you speak about uh, creating embarrassing moments
Mhm. Yeah.
so that you can practice. I love that. And
Mm.
it's like I have for certain kinds of things I've practiced and I enjoy practicing, like forgetting. I
Mhm.
don't mind forgetting, especially if sometimes I've challenged myself to do a 6-part something in a talk.
Yep.
And I say, I know I'm going to forget, but it'll give me an
Mhm.
opportunity to say, can't remember number 4. I'll be back to that
Yes.
and move
Yes.
on. And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for modeling what to do when you forget."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's it. It's like we don't know how to handle these experiences in a
Yep.
way that is graceful or poised or funny or what's the other word? That we amusing, that we can allow ourselves to feel amused by our
Mhm.
foibles.
Yeah, and I think one of the most freeing pieces of knowledge, and I speak to this in the book, is there's a phenomenon called the pratfall effect, which is if you are generally someone who is seen as smart, capable, competent in what they do. So in your case, Linda, you went through 6 steps, kind of fudged the 4th one, but generally they're like, she knows what she's talking about. Then guess what? When you blunder, when you misstep, you are not seen as inept. You're actually seen as very relatable because that one little misstep knocks you off this golden pedestal of, gosh, this woman is so on it that I could never be that confident. I could
Right.
never get to that point. And so, again, people often fear, if I have an awkward moment, an embarrassment, am I going to be perceived as inept? If generally speaking, you've done a good job, you've worked hard, you've prepared, you come across as competent and smart, and you've done the work, no, you won't. That's the good news. You actually come across as, oh, good. They're just like us. There's that whole Us magazine, right? Celebrities.
Yes,
They're just
yes.
like us. There's a reason we like that because we love that relatability.
Yes, yes, and I love how in the book you say, "Aiming for flawlessness is futile." Futile?
Mhm.
Futile? I don't know
Either
how
or. I think it depends where you live.
and and people will like you less if you try to be flawless.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's frustrating. It's a battle that none of us can win. In the Instagram and AI filter world, we can filter out everything and everyone to some fake perfection. And I think increasingly we're over it. We're like, give us the real stuff, right? Give us what we actually want to see. I
I
love that
just
too.
yeah, so Teresa said, "We think, our audience," going back to the engagement, "we think that they're not engaged, maybe they're taking notes or looking up your website." I
I,
mean, yes, it could be not
yeah.
just, other things that are distracting them, but it could be, like,
Yeah.
things that are showing their engagement. And
I ha I have to laugh because this happened to me once. I was in a small group and I jokingly said to someone, I said, "Gosh, it must be boring you since you're on your phone." And she goes, "I was just linking up with you on LinkedIn." I was like, "Oops,
Right, that's right.
miss."
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, it could be it's so funny. So we tend to envision the worst, but we could also envision the best.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love
So,
that.
I love your ideas for humor. Let's talk about improv. You have a whole chapter on improv, which I'm so glad you include that because I feel
Mhm.
like there's so many tools in it that can help us. So let's talk about some of those tools of improv
Sure.
that help us with awkwardness. And you actually
Yeah.
talked about it a little bit earlier when you're talking about how you handle a room that wasn't engaged. You were
Yeah.
using some improv there.
Yeah, I think in the context too of speaking or presenting specifically, we are not talking about, improv, what people often associate with comedy. And what we're not talking about is being a stand-up comedian. So if you are trying to give a presentation, if you were to use the stand-up comparison, it's, delivering on material as written, prescriptive, right? This is the rehearsed, this is how it's going to go. What the principles of improv tell us is that life is uncertain. You cannot predict that someone is going to sneeze in the audience, that they're going to go into labor in the audience, that they're going to react in a way that you didn't expect at all. And the primary mantra of improv is yes and, meaning rather than letting it throw us, how do we learn to roll with it? And so there's a variety of improv exercises we can do that essentially teach us how to be radically present in the moment and be able to learn how to bob and weave with whatever reality throws at us. But it is a muscle to build. If you've ever considered taking an improv class, you will learn very quickly on day one that this is a muscle that often is not flexed with frequency. We increasingly live in a world where we're communicating digitally, which means not only do we not have the person to person interaction, but there's a delay. there's a lag in when somebody texts us back or if somebody responds. And so what improv teaches us to do is learn how to be responsive and to roll with the uncertainty in the moment, no matter what gets thrown at you. And I think that skill set, especially for presenters, is one of the most valuable that you can
Yes.
nurture.
Yes. And what I love that you mentioned before about pivoting
Yeah.
when something wasn't going right is the
Yep.
idea of that everything that happens is your material.
Yes.
So you don't hang on to what you were planning to do, or you thought maybe you say begin a story and you expect it to go a certain way, but someone else takes it in a different direction. You
Right.
don't stick with your own original idea. You go with what is current,
Yes.
and you
Yes.
keep moving it forward, right?
Yeah, and I think using improv tools in any awkward situation, but especially in presenting, it's not about not having a plan, right? You still want to be rehearsed, you still want to have a plan, but I love the idea of having that plan loosely held, and improv tools allow you to do that.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And it's practice in handling uncertainty,
Mhm.
right? That's what you say in the book. You say you practice um, coming up with quick ideas
Yep.
and allowing them to be
Whatever they are. Right.
whatever they are,
Right.
and allowing yourself to suck, to be a
Yeah.
beginner, to have things
Yeah.
come out awkward,
Yes.
and have that
Yeah.
be okay. And what's so nice about something like an improv class, it's why I also love my Comfy on Camera class, is that it's deliberate. You say something about uh, intentional awkwardness in a safe environment, or
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think
exactly
that's
right.
so important to be able to have a safe environment where we can explore letting things just come out of our mouths.
Right, right,
And
and I think
and
that that's the key because we don't always know, is it okay to experiment in this way, in this environment? Improv classes are a very safe space to do that.
very, very safe space, and you get to a place, and this is what I attempt to do in the Comfy on Camera, where you want to do it the next time because
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
interesting. It's like, "What am I gonna do?
right,
And so you get comfortable with that uncertainty. You get comfortable
yeah.
with the awkwardness.
You get comfortable with unpredictability, with
Yes.
uncertainty, and the inevitable awkwardness that exists in those places, yes.
Yes, yes. So what do you wanna leave our audience with today? What have we not
Ugh,
covered that you really want them to know?
oh, we've covered so much, but if I could leave with one sort of parting mantra, one parting plea, it would be prepared, but don't wait until you're ready. Just do it awkwardly, but do it anyway. People will appreciate you more for it because it's not your experience, it's all of our experience. And we can relate to you so much more when you just show up, missteps, blunders, fumbles, and all.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your inspiration and for your amazing book. I loved it.
Thank
I
you.
told you beforehand, I took 6 pages of notes.
I love it. Thank you
I've
so much.
I've left a review, and for anyone who's listening, reviews are great for authors, so read her book, leave a review. Where can people find you?
I am Henna Pryor in all the places. LinkedIn and Instagram are my two favorite places. LinkedIn the most, and hennapryor.com or goodawkward.com.
Yes, and that's Henna,
Yes.
and then Pryor. That's great, and be sure you pick up her book, Good Awkward.
Yes. Thank you, Linda.
Wonderful.
Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. Wishing everybody who has been listening, I hope you've enjoyed this. Be sure to watch the Delight in the Limelight podcast, and we are hoping that you have a delightful day in all your limelight moments.